So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mitch Case. I'm a former student here at Korah, and I am the president of the Métis Nation of Ontario Youth Council, and I sit on the provincial council of the Métis Nation of Ontario as well as the Métis National Council. And my day job, I work at Chingwak Kinumagegimik, which is the little house on the side of Algoma University, and so we administer the Anishinaabe Studies program there. So that's my day job, and I'm very excited to be here.
What is the definition of a person who is Métis?
Very good question. So today we have a definition. There's like three parts of a definition that the Supreme Court codified in a case that we know as the Powley case. But that's a really technical definition, and it works for legal purposes. But the way I like to define who Métis people are is today we are the descendants of the historic Métis Nation, right? So we're the descendants of people who were the descendants of a people who grew up in a very specific time and a very specific place in the history of North America, right? And I say North America because our history crosses the boundary, that imaginary line between Canada and the United States. But we're descended from the sort of original people who were known as half-breeds, right? Which is not a great term. We don't use that very often anymore. But over the years, we were known by a lot of different names. We were known as half-breeds. We were known as bois brûlés, coureurs de bois. We were known as in Ojibwe. The name that I really like the sound of and the meaning behind is Wisakudewininuk, right? Which means after a forest fire. And you know how like new things grow right after a fire, right? Everything's really green, right? And it talks about how our people were born out of that, right? And born out of the mixing together of two very different people, primarily original French people who moved here in the 1600s, and Ojibwe and Cree women, right? And over time, we formed our own culture and our own way of life. So, yeah, good question.
Why is the term Métis not used in the United States?
So, in some parts of the United States, it's still used, but in most in Michigan and Minnesota, and that a lot of the Métis communities were absorbed into what in the States what they refer to as Indian tribes, right, or as we in Canada would call First Nations, right? And so a lot of our people were sort of absorbed into First Nations communities or Indian bands in the States. But in North Dakota, there's a community, if you ever have a chance to do a little bit of research, but there's a community called Turtle Mountain. And the Turtle Mountain Reservation has basically three different communities living on the reservation. And there's a Michif community, or the Métis community, Michif community. And then there's a Dakota community and an Ojibwe community, all on the same reservation, right? So there are still places where the term is used a little bit, but mostly they were sort of absorbed into, sadly, that they sort of lost their identity and were absorbed into either one of those First Nations or into sort of dominant American society. Yeah.
Could you talk about the artifacts you brought with you today?
Sure can. Let's do that. So if you look here, I don't know where we should start, but if you look up here, this is a sort of modern take on some old traditional beadwork. That coat and that vest, those were my sister and I. We sort of tag teamed on that one, and one of us we did one side. I did one side, my sister did the other, and we're sort of just working to try and keep that Métis beadwork tradition alive. But I'll talk about beadwork a little bit later on. But then these guys here, these are some beaded, what do you call them? I guess mitts, I guess. that originally came down from up near Fort Albany, up on the James Bay, and then these, shout out to a local business, rescued these from the mill market about 2 weeks ago. So, and then we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about sashes later. I think there's a question about sashes, so we'll talk about those a little bit later. But there's one there and then one here.
What can you tell us about the earliest Métis families of Sault Ste. Marie?
Sorry, what's that?
What can you tell us about the earliest families of Sault Ste. Marie? I mean, earliest Métis families of Sault Ste. Marie.
For sure. Okay, so the earliest Métis families started to emerge here around the same time as other Métis communities were forming around the Great Lakes, which is sort of be the mid to late 1700s. And so the Northwest Company, right? So the Northwest Company had a post on what is now basically where the mill market is now, right? In the old St. Mary's paper site. And that was the Northwest Company post. And Sault Ste. Marie was sort of almost like a retirement community for old voyageurs, right? And so voyageurs, they retired young. They started young. They started working in the fur trade when they were about maybe 16. And then after 10, 15 years of carrying these incredibly heavy packs of furs and canoeing from Montreal to Alberta, right? They were ready for retirement around like 40, right? So, but they still had a lot of life left, right? They just couldn't be voyageuring anymore, right? So they started to form communities, right, of these retired voyageurs, and then they started to marry with some of the First Nations women in the community, right? And then from there, they formed together and over time, right, through a process we call ethnogenesis, right, and formed a new people, formed a new community. And some of those old families were like some of those names are still around, the Cadot family and Busno family and others, right? Yeah, so that's a little bit about the very early foundations of that. Well, we'll come back to it a little bit more later on.
Do Métis all follow a common spiritual belief?
I'd say yes and no. I'd say today a lot of Métis people are predominantly Catholic because of our sort of our mixed inheritance from our Ojibwe and Cree histories of our families, but then from the French Catholic families, right, on our way off paternal ancestors' sides. And so there's a lot of, and then because of the effects of residential school and that our people have adopted, a lot of our people have adopted, especially Catholicism. But then there's a lot of our people also that have maintained a lot of the old traditions that we inherited originally from our maternal ancestors. And then I'd say that the common belief between those two in our community is a really deep sense of respect for each other. And so in our communities, it's not really, it's, oh yeah, well that guy goes to Sweats and that guy goes to church, and those people, they do both, right? They go to Sweat on Saturday and church on Sunday. They do their thing, right? So I think that's the common thing I would say is a belief in our history, right? And a belief in our ancestors, right? And the caution that I say all the time is to remember that we don't exist in a vacuum, and we're not a people that is preserved in a box the way we used to be. We're a living, breathing culture that continues to adapt. And some people say, oh no, we don't do that. That's a First Nations thing. And my answer to that is always, well, yeah, but like for about 100 years, their First Nations didn't do it either because it wasn't allowed, right? And so we have to be critical about those things. We have to think critically about, why is it that we don't live a certain way, right? And what is that a choice we made on purpose, or was that something that was beyond our control, right? So it's a big question, but I think that the underlying answer is just a really deep respect for everyone communicating with the spirit in their own way.
tell us about Métis art?
Sure, yeah. I think our people were really mobile for a long time, right? We were very mobile. Here and around the Great Lakes, of course, the fur trade, and then moving around, living off the land. Our people moved a lot, right? And then to the west of us, our relatives in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and into Alberta, they moved around lots on the buffalo hunt, right? So they were chasing buffalo all over, basically the western half of the central part of the continent. And so when you're talking about artwork, not often a lot of big paintings to go on the wall of your, very portable teepee, right? And so our artwork became things that we could take with us, right? And so there are like old Métis artifacts that are basically from head to toe. You could be covered in beadwork. There's these, if you get a chance to look them up, they're Métis smoking caps. They're these little tiny hats that are basically fully beaded, right? And then beaded vests, and then beaded moccasins, and beaded, before they came up with like pants, like we know as pants today, they were more like legging sort of things, so you would like sort of like strap on kind of deal. And those would be beaded, right? And so you could sort of take your artwork with you, right? And you could, and a lot of those floral patterns were it's often not recognized that Métis people were probably the first ones in the Great Lakes area to have floral beadwork patterns. Before that, a lot of First Nations had geometric patterns, right? Which are beautifully intricate, but they're very different than the Métis floral patterns that developed. And those patterns, they often tell stories, and they're often, I've heard stories about coats that had maps beaded into them, right? So that you could forever know the route you were on by the vest you were wearing or by the coat you were wearing. And that beadwork is influenced by the flowers and the plants and the medicines that grow around us. And then also some of the original design and aesthetics features came from the stained glass windows that the French voyageurs remembered in Montreal, right? Or remembered even for those who had come from, like, directly from France. A lot of those patterns, if you were to look at some of those old stained glass windows, you can see an influence there, right? So, yeah.
Could you tell us about Métis music?
Oh yeah, awesome. Métis music is, there's a lot of influences, and there are ceremonies where we still use the drum and those sorts of things for certain ceremonies and cultural practices. But the music that I think we're probably known for is like incredibly upbeat fiddle music, and it's sort of a mix of like French and Scottish fiddle music mixed with rhythms and then dancing that is very heavily influenced by Plains and Great Lakes region First Nations communities and dance styles. Maybe we can play a little bit of Red River Jig at the end of this, and you can hear the sound of that fiddle. That's just incredibly. We're sort of known for our ridiculous overconfidence, almost, I'll say, and our just love of life, and having my friend and sort of mentor of mine, France Picot, always talks about, when we go to political meetings, we work very, very hard all day long, and then we party very, very hard most of the night. And there's fiddle music, and there's just a love of life. Yeah.
How did you become involved in the Métis tradition?
So, mostly just through my family. A lot of my family, my mom and my grandpa and my uncle, and then some of my cousins who live in in Barrie area. They sort of maintained a connection and a sort of a determination to learn, and they just provided opportunities, right? Provided opportunities for me to go places and to learn things, and then I met up with some really cool leadership in my community. Some people known as the Powleys, who we'll talk about a little bit later on, and whose story is very important for the history of our people. But I met up with Kim and Brenda and Ann Trudell, another community leader here in the Sioux. And they got me involved, and they started just bringing me to everything. And then I met up with some other, a lot of elders across Ontario who just gave me opportunities, I think, to make sure that I could learn as much as I could. So, yeah.
Could you tell us about the Métis sash?
For sure. So this one here, there's a picture too. Oh, hang on, get another one. So this is like the most common sash pattern that we see today. It's kind of just the one that's the generic one that's just kind of out there everywhere. And then, I'll go back. So does anybody know what the number one cause of death for a voyageur was? Any guesses? Freezing? Oh, that's a good guess. You don't know? What do you think? Any guesses? Yeah? Starvation. Oh, that's a good one too. The one everybody always guesses is drowning, right? Everybody says, oh, they probably fell out of the boat. The number one cause of death, and this nobody ever gets it, was infected hernias, because they would lift these 300-pound packs of furs, and then they would get a hernia, right, in their side, right? And then, of course, they were out in the middle of nowhere, and they didn't have a doctor, and they didn't have access to the kind of things that, today a hernia is like a 10-minute operation, right? But so they, over time, you ever see like those Olympic weight lifters, and they have like that weight belt, right? So this is a Métis weight belt, essentially, right? And so they would wrap that around 2 or 3 times as tight as possible, right? And then you could lift those packs, and you wouldn't risk basically tearing the lining in your stomach, right? And so because they were wearing them anyway, right? Over time, the women in the community said like they developed patterns, and so over time you would be able to tell where somebody was from based on the pattern and based on the colors. And so this pattern here is known as the Coventry pattern. So the Hudson's Bay Company had those produced in Coventry, England, and they would ship them over, and then they would use them as like trade goods, right? So they would trade with Métis communities, and so that's where that pattern came from. And then this pattern here, there's a guy named Miguel, whose last name I can't remember, but he's from Manitoba, and he has done probably the most extensive research on sashes, and this is the pattern that his research shows was very prevalent here in the Great Lakes area. It's also coincidentally the strongest one, which I don't think is a coincidence. I think that if you're going to survive around Lake Superior in January, I think there's a reason why we've got the strongest sash, just saying. So, but there's, I could have brought my whole collection, but it's basically like a duffel bag full of sashes, and so I didn't think that was very good use of our time today. But today there are so many patterns, so many different variations, different color patterns. The Métis Nation of British Columbia had a special one produced just for when they were co-hosting the Olympics with the First Nations in BC. So it's you'll see shirts with them made. It's just they're kind of everywhere now, right? But
Could you tell us about the Métis flag?
for sure. So that's that one right there, right? So there's some. We're actually next week. I'm going to be in Winnipeg for the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Seven Oaks. And the Battle of Seven Oaks is the first time in history that the Métis flag was flown in battle, right? And so this was basically it was a little skirmish between And it's one of those things too, right? It's we refer to it as a battle, but throughout history, it was the history books referred to it as a massacre because we won, right? And so when we win, it's a massacre. When the government wins, it's a battle, right? But we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of the first time that flag was used in battle. But the history of that, some of the earliest recorded usage of that was around Fort William, which is now Thunder Bay. It represents the coming together of two very different people to form something that is now, in and of itself, something completely different, right? If you see that flag, right, you can see those two original circles, but but there is now something new that has been created that we say will live on forever, right? That infinity symbol we will carry on forever, right?
Is there a Métis language?
Yeah, good question. So, for a long time, our language went unrecognized by government and by others. And so the Michif language is what we refer to the language as, is the Michif language, and that language is a combination, much like our people, of predominantly French and then Ojibwe and Cree languages, right? And so most Métis people, 150 years ago, they were fluent in French, they were fluent in Cree, they were fluent in Ojibwe. Some of them might have spoke English, right? And so they could converse with anyone that they would run into in their homeland, right? But then in their homes and in their communities, when they were just talking to each other, over time a language developed that for them made a lot of sense. And so the nouns, I believe, I'm not a Michif language speaker, but the nouns are predominantly French nouns and then Cree verbs, right? And so if you speak Cree, then you know half of what's going on. And if you speak French, you know the other half of what's going on. But unless you speak either both or Michif fluently, you wouldn't really know what was going on, right? It would be it would be like, having like a translator, but only half the time, right? So over time, there's different dialects of Michif. And in Ontario, our languages have a lot more French influence. And then as you move westward to Saskatchewan and Alberta, it's got a lot more Cree influence, right? So it's very dependent on the community you're in, but there certainly is a language there that we're working hard to ensure survives.
What are the most important issues facing Métis today?
Good question. This is that's pretty much kind of what I do now, is helping deal with those issues. But for our communities today, our often statistics show that it's almost like our history sort of repeating itself again. In statistics, in educational attainment, in health outcomes, and all those sorts of things, we're below the Canadian average, but somewhat higher often than First Nations communities, right? And often that's because of the extreme isolation in a lot of First Nations communities that is an issue that certainly needs to be dealt with. But working on, for me, one of the biggest things that I'm passionate about is the recognition of the Métis people, right? All too often, government and industry and school boards and things, they forget that we're here entirely, right? That for me is I think is at the core of a lot of our issues, right? Because if government, if industry doesn't recognize that we're here, recognize that we're a rights-bearing people, recognize that we undeniably have Section 35 constitutionally protected rights, if they don't recognize those things, it's going to be impossible for us to deal with those issues, right? Those issues of educational attainment, of poverty, of loss of language, right? We were talking about Michif language, loss of language. And then access to land, because the Métis people, we, if there's a slide there, Peter, I think it's, yeah, that one. So essentially, inside of that blue circle, right, that's sort of the history of when settlers established the first settlements in what is now central Canada. They refer to it as. I don't know how that happens because it's definitely on the pretty extreme one side. But anyway, everything inside those red lines is what we sort of identify today as the Métis homeland, right? From Georgian Bay westward, essentially, right? And that territory, we're statistically we're the largest Indigenous nation in North America, and that's certainly a shared territory. We don't claim any exclusivity over it, but that territory is the place that gave birth to our people, right? And today, there were many treaty promises made in Ontario. There are many outstanding land issues here in Ontario. In Manitoba, the Manitoba Métis Federation is just now being able to deal with their land claim that's outstanding since 1870. And in Alberta, Alberta is the only place in Canada where Métis have actual recognized land, and there's 8 essentially like reserves. It's almost the same setup as what government has set up for First Nations. There's the 8 Métis settlements in Alberta. But outside of Alberta, it's very difficult for our people to maintain our culture, considering that that's the vast expanse of territory that we used to be able to live off of. And today, with the exception of in Alberta, right, there is no place that we can call our home, right? There is no place that we can just go to, and that to just be our community, right? So those are some of the issues that we're dealing with today.
Who was Louis Riel?
Louis Riel, he's like most famous Métis guy ever. In 1869, Canada Canada made a deal with the Hudson's Bay Company to purchase basically the old Northwest, which was basically a huge part of what is now Manitoba, and they made that deal without talking to the First Nations or to the Métis people in Manitoba. And in Red River at the time, so Red River is sort of seen as the capital of the Métis Nation, right? There was about 7,000 people there, and of those 7,000 people in Red River, 6,000 of them were Métis people. That was a huge Métis community, right? And the government did not talk to them, did not consult with them. And so Louis Riel and the provisional government that he established in 1869, they took a stand, and they captured Fort Garry. They stood up against the Canadian government, and the Canadian government recognized that what they had done was not right, that they had to negotiate. And they negotiated what we know now as the Manitoba Treaty, which was then codified in the Manitoba Act, right? And they promised that they would give, that they would not give. I don't acknowledge that they had the authority to give us anything, but that they would recognize 1.4 million acres to be set aside for the children of the families that were in the Red River settlement, right? And so Canada agreed to and promised to set aside that land, and then broke that promise, essentially. Only about 2% of that land ever ended up in Métis hands. The rest of it was taken fraudulently. And the Métis people in Manitoba ended up having to mostly move westward. Some came east to Ontario and settled among their other relatives here in Métis communities in Ontario. And a lot moved westward, right? And then Louis Riel was sent into exile, and he lived in the United States because of his role in leading the Red River resistance. Some people call it a rebellion. I don't agree with that term. To us, it is a resistance, right? So 15 years later, Canada is repeating the process. Canada is going to now do to Saskatchewan what they did to Manitoba. They're just going to take it over, right? And so the Métis people there, under the leadership of Gabriel Dumont, who was one of the finest leaders that our people have ever seen, they stood up and said, this is not right. But Gabriel Dumont, he was fluent in 7 languages, but he couldn't read or write in English, right? And so he said, well, I can't, as a leader, I can't communicate with the government. So he went to Montana and convinced Louis Riel to come back, right? And Louis Riel went back to Saskatchewan, and there was the Northwest Resistance in 1885. And the British Canada sent troops out there, and there was a series of battles leading to Batoche, and then Louis Riel surrendered at Batoche. And then the Canadian government used an old British law from, I can't even remember what year it was, like from like the year like 1264. Don't actually quote me on that, but it was like an incredibly arcane law that was no longer in use in order to execute Louis Riel, and they executed him on November 16th, 1885. And today we recognize him as he's recognized as the founder of the province of Manitoba. He's recognized as one of our incredibly influential leaders who we still draw inspiration from his endless determination to fight for what was right for his community and for our people, right?
What was the Mica Bay incident of 1849, and how were the Métis involved in the Robinson-Huron Treaty that was signed in Sault Ste. Marie in 1850?
Awesome question. So, Canada, the British in 1763, the British Crown declared what they call the Royal Proclamation, right? That said that in order for Britain to take any land from Indigenous people, that they had to get permission, right? And that's where the idea of treaties comes from, right? And in the 1840s, there were mining companies that were mining here in the area around Sault Ste. Marie, and they were operating there was no treaty, right? Canada hadn't gotten permission or consent from the original people here, from the Métis people, from the Ojibwe people, from the Odawa people. They just simply didn't have that permission. So the Mica Bay incident, 1848, 1849-ish, in the fall of that 1848, the First Nations community, under the leadership of 2 of their most well-known and respected chiefs, Chief Chingwak Kons and Chief Nemnegoching, and the Métis community under the leadership of Eustache Lesage and Charles Boyer and Pierre Boyer, or Pierre Lesage, sorry. They organized together. They got people from the Métis community and from the First Nations community, and they went to Mica Bay and they borrowed a cannon from the old fort, and they went there and shut the mine down, right? And they said, you don't have permission to be taking our resources without an agreement, right? You have to get an agreement with us. And so the 4 of them, the 4 leadership were arrested. Chief Chingwak and Chief Nemnegoching ended up in Toronto. They were let go because the judge said, yeah, they're right. They're just simply right. You have to get a treaty with them. So September, the next year, 1849, the Vidal-Anderson Commission came up here. And there's another map. I think it's the next slide. There it is. So the Vidal-Anderson Commission, they came up here and they were sent to study, to see who are the people that are up there. Who are we going to have to deal with, right? And they wrote a report that talked about dealing with the First Nations and dealing in some way with the claims of the Métis people. And if you look here, so I wish I had a laser pointer or something, but you see that sort of big square almost in the center of the map. So that's the only building that's on that map that still exists today. That's the old stone house, right? So that's the Ermentinger Clerk house that's there, right? This map shows the original settlement, right? The original Métis settlement that was here. And so those two that are highlighted in yellow, those are actually two of my sort of direct answers. I'm related to a lot of people on that map, but the most direct link is through those two, the Busno family, right? Who were the biggest, one of the biggest Métis families here at the time. And so when the treaty was signed, Chief Shingwak and Chief Nemnagoching, they stood up and they said that they would not agree to signing the treaty until the rights of the half-breeds, right, as we were then known to the law, were recognized, right? And our people had written petitions and said that our land rights had to be recognized. And so the treaty commissioner, Robinson, he said, well, I don't have a mandate to deal with the half-breeds. I only have a mandate to deal with the Indians, right? And I use that language because that's the language of the time, right? We don't talk like that anymore. But he said, I don't have a mandate to deal with them, but I can come back next year with a mandate. So that was 1850. So 166 years later, we're still waiting. He never came back, right? But they promised that the land that we lived on at the time would be protected, that we would be able to maintain that. Within 10 years, 90% of that had been lost to settlers coming in and to using their overwhelming economic power to force our community out. And so we're still waiting for that promise, right? And that's considered to be an issue of the honor of the crown, right? Because as someone who was authorized by the crown, by the government, to come here and to speak on the government's behalf, made a commitment that they would return to make that treaty. They never returned, right? And so that's a very serious violation of the honor of the crown, right? So those are issues that we, going back to that previous question about issues that we have today, right? This is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, right? Is that promise that was made to our community, that promise is going to have to be lived up to someday, right? That promise is going to have to be lived up to because the honor of the crown is at stake, right?
What was the Chicora incident, and did the Métis of Sault Ste. Marie have any involvement in the Chicora incident?
Good question. I don't know how much involvement we would have had, but the Chicora incident, to my understanding, is when we were talking about the Louis Riel, right? And when the government was sending those troops out there in 1870, they had to pass the locks that are here now. They weren't there then, right? And the oldest locks that were here were those were at the Northwest Company fort, but those were burned down during the War of 1812. The Americans burned basically our whole village to the ground, right? And they burned the locks up. And so by that point, the Americans had locks built on the American side, right? And the United States government wouldn't let them pass. They wouldn't let them go. They wouldn't let them bring military equipment through the locks because mostly the Americans, don't kid yourself, they had no interest in protecting Louis Riel or the Métis people. They just didn't want the British, or the Canadians rather, to assert themselves and establish any sort of real control over what is now Western Canada, because at that time the Americans still had, at that time they still had this idea that they were destined to run the whole continent, right? And so they were in no mood to help Canada establish any sort of dominance out there. And so it went on for a few weeks, and the Americans wouldn't allow this boat, the Chicora, to pass through the locks. They ended up having to unload all the military equipment and then carry it from somewhere east of the Sioux, basically out to Gros Cap, past the locks, right, on the old fur trading route, right? And I don't know, I don't know what influence we would have had at that time, because by 1870, about 90% of our community had been relocated out of the Sioux, right? And we're either living in Agua Bay and Montreal River and those places north of here, or at the invitation of Chief Shingwak and his sons and his community in Garden River, about half of our community, including my family, moved to the reserve, right? And we're in Garden River. So I don't know how much activity we would have been involved in with the Chicora incident.
Did the Métis of Sault Ste. Marie have any involvement in the Red River Rebellion?
Somewhat, in an interesting way. So again, by that point, most of our community, because of the huge influx of settlers into our community and having to relocate and loss of land, a lot of families had moved westward, and so they were there during the events of the resistance in 1869, 1870, and so sort of by extension, our families were involved in that because of the connection, right? And then the same thing in 1885 in Batoche. There were families in Batoche who were connected with families here in Sault Ste. Marie, the Nolan family, and others. But before the resistance, 1869, in 1848, 1849, there was a trial known as the Sayers trial in Manitoba. A guy named Guillaume Sayre had been charged with trading furs across the American border, and so Louis Riel Sr., Louis Riel's father, him and the rest of that community, they stood up and they said, no, we're not going to abide by these imaginary rules that the Hudson's Bay Company established. This is our territory and we'll trade with whoever we want to trade with. And so they found Guillaume Sayre guilty, but they refused to, the judge didn't put a penalty because the courthouse was completely surrounded by hundreds of Métis people who were armed. And the judge didn't want to deal with that, essentially, right? And so, but Guillaume Sayre his family was from here, right? The Sayres family here in Sault Ste. Marie and in Blind River area, that's his family, and they were moving back and forth between here and Red River, right? Previous to that, I talked earlier about the Battle of Seven Oaks, right? When that battle happened in the early 1800s, I can't remember, would have been 1816, right? So 1816, the Métis community here sent a couple of canoes full of I don't know what the term is, voyageurs, warriors, soldiers, whatever, westward. They were stopped near, just outside of what is now Fort Francis, by Hudson's Bay Company forces before they could actually get to Red River, but they participated certainly in supporting that effort during the Battle of Seven Oaks.
Some people have called the Métis story a hidden history. Why is that?
Very good. So, after, to be quite honest, like Canada had an approach, which was to, in many ways, ignore Indigenous people as much as possible, right? And to make sure there were as few of us as possible, both through some very problematic historical happenings such as residential schools and other things like that were in many ways meant to ensure that we weren't here physically, right? But also administratively, when they created the Indian Act and they started to then remove people from who is considered an Indian, right? The federal government and the provinces basically both refused to take any responsibility for Métis people and recognizing any responsibility to our communities whatsoever. And so our people, in many circumstances, had to pretend to be somebody else in order to get any sort of assistance. So they had to either pretend to be to just be French, or pretend to be Ojibwe and get onto one of the treaty lists, right? Or to pretend to be Cree or whatever, right? Or and not pretend, but to identify with those other identities, right? And so for a long time, our stories, and then like after the resistance in 1885, being Métis was very unpopular, right? And there are quotes from the historical record referring to Métis people because of the intense racism in Canada. Like let's not kid ourselves, right? That this Canada has a very problematic past, right? And we were referred to as being too French, too Catholic, and too Indian, right? And in the Orange Lodge, Ontario, right, run by very anti-Catholic Protestants who had no love for Aboriginal people, it was often safer just to not say anything, just to not talk about who we were, right? And then it became easier for Canada to ignore our story, to ignore our rights and those sorts of things. We've turned that around now. We are working to make sure we are no longer forgotten. So.
How are Métis different from First Nations?
So that's a very complicated question, and in many ways we aren't, right? In many ways we are very much the same as our First Nations relatives. A lot of our culture, a lot of our way of life, our connection to land, our stories, our songs, a lot of that is very, very much the same. But I would say that the thing that makes us different is our connection to our stories as descendants of those original communities of that formed around the Great Lakes and into Manitoba. I think that's the biggest thing. It's about connection to stories, right? And I think about that, and the reality is that, I don't think we're as different as we sometimes think that we are, right? And I think that often comes out of the need to assert ourselves against that sort of colonial system, right? But we certainly do have different aspects of our culture, right? Our fiddle music, our dancing, and those sorts of things are very, in a lot of ways, very distinct to Métis people. But I often think that we're a lot more similar than we sometimes think we are.
Why is being Métis important to you?
So, I think that leads off the last question also. It's about those stories, right? It's about those stories that some of which have survived in my family, some of them have survived in our community, and in a weird way, some of them have survived in the notes of the people who were sent here to make sure that we weren't here, right? The soldiers and the priests and all those people. Some of those stories, ironically, have survived in their journals. I wonder what they would think of that now. But for me, it's about making sure that those stories live on, right? And the only way those stories live is if we tell them, right? And the only way we can tell them is if we take the time to listen to them, right? And to learn them and to understand their importance, understand where it is that we come from, and who we really are, right? We're in this process of sort of decolonizing, right? And unlearning some of the habits that maybe have been learned as a result of residential schools and assimilation and those sorts of tactics used by Canada over the last century and a half, right? But for me, it's about just making sure that those stories continue, right? And then thinking about it in the sense of not only ensuring that those stories continue, but ensuring that that the story continues to be written, right? That in 50 years from now or 100 years from now, that there are stories from this time that are added to that bundle of stories from the beginning of our nation 200 and some years ago to now, right? And that we in our time contribute to that, right? And that if we successfully pass that on, then those who come after us will then add to that as well, right? That's why it's so important to me to be involved.
Could you tell us about the Powley case?
Sure, yeah. So 1982, the Constitution was brought home from England, and part of the new Constitution was Section 35, right? And Section 35 says that the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed, and for greater certainty, the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are the Indian, Inuit, and First Nations people, Indian, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. And nobody really knew what that meant, right? Our people thought that means they're going to recognize all of our rights. Government thought that it meant nothing, and we would have to essentially prove our rights on a case-by-case basis, right? So in the late 80s, some of the community members around this area, around Sault Ste. Marie, they started to try to get charged by the MNR for hunting without a license, right? Because they said if we get charged, we can go to court and we can prove that we have a right. So one of the guys who tried to get charged was Art Bennett. He tried, I think, twice to get charged, and they wouldn't charge him. We think it's probably because it was very obvious that he was trying to get charged, and so the government wouldn't charge him. And then in 93, the MNR game wardens charged Steve and Rod Powley with shooting a moose without a license, right? And Steve had tagged the moose with a note with his Métis card that said, harvesting my meat for winter, right? Just a simple note. They charged him, and 10 years, for the next 10 years, his family and our community and the entire Métis Nation spent in court from the first level of court here in Sault Ste. Marie through the next 3 levels of court to the Supreme Court. Over that 10 years, 4 levels of court and 14 judges heard that case. Not one judge disagreed with the fact that we were an Indigenous people, that we had unceded and unsurrendered rights, and that one of those rights was the right to hunt and fish for food, right? So over the 10-year battle, it really brought our community together to ensure that we kept up that fight to ensure that our rights to harvest were recognized. And now we have sort of a pretty good harvesting agreement with Ontario. There's some work to do there, but we're working on it. The Manitoba Métis Federation in Manitoba, they have just concluded 2 years ago a fantastic deal that's modeled after our deal. Alberta is working on a similar deal. Saskatchewan is very close to signing a deal with the provincial governments in those areas to ensure that they will recognize the rights of those communities, right? So from Powley, we have had the whole universe has changed for Métis people since the decision, right? That affirmed that we are, in the eyes of Canadian law, that we are here and that we have rights and that they have to be respected, right?
Could you tell us about the Harry Daniels case?
Oh, sure. So we're running out of time, so I'll very quickly tell you about the Daniels case. So the Constitution, right, divides powers between the federal and provincial governments, right? For basically the last century, the federal and provincial governments have argued, nope, they're your problem. Nope, they're your problem. Nope, we're not dealing with them, they're your problem, right? They did not want to deal with Métis people. And so a Métis leader named Harry Daniels from Saskatchewan, he said enough is enough, and he sued the federal government, and he took them to court. and that took 17 years. We thought Powley took a long time, right? That took 17 years, but the federal government, the Supreme Court now has decided unanimously that the Métis people are considered Indians under Section 9124 of the Constitution, which means that we are a federal responsibility. So it is the federal government who, just like with First Nations and just like with Inuit, have to sit down and recognize our rights and have to negotiate with us on what that looks like, right? And so Powley, the Manitoba Métis Federation land claim case, and the Daniels case now, 100 years ago, we were fighting 130 years ago, we were fighting in Batoche. The Métis people out west had fought in the Red River Resistance, had fought in the Northwest Resistance. Our people had fought at Mica Bay. We were prepared at that time to pick up guns and fight for our rights. Today, we sent a lot of our young people to law school, and now we've picked up those tools, and we have not lost a case since, right? We continue to assert who we are, and we continue to use those tools to ensure that our rights are protected, and that our place here in our homeland is protected and respected by those settler governments, right?
Is there anything else you'd like to say that you haven't been asked?
Oh yeah, lots. No, I think just as sort of a concluding remark, I just encourage you all to learn as much as you can about the Métis Nation, but also about First Nations, right? And learning about the true history of Canada, right? And the true history of our community here, right? Our community here in Sault Ste. Marie and area, right? And understand that that historic Métis community, right? Those people, the descendants of those people, were still here, right? We're still here. Our stories are still here. When I walk downtown, I've almost got that map memorized, right? When I walk down by the mall, I know almost all the names of those families, of whose land that is, right? And whose farms those were, right? And so, as people who live here in this community, right? Take a little bit more time and learn about the community here. There's 3,000 of us descended from those people, right? Living here in Sault Ste. Marie today, right? And so I just really encourage you to learn about that, and to if you're a Métis person, connect with that, connect with your ancestry, connect with our stories, and be a part of writing the next chapter of the story. So I think that's where I'll leave it there.